Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper of 17th of April 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. We have these 5 articles that we are going to discuss in detail. First is Israel should stand down to avoid a regional war in the West Asia. This is on your editorial page. Let's have a discussion on it. Then a couple of articles which are based on electoral reforms and EVMs, etc. So we'll discuss them. Then apart from that, we have something related to green bonds and FIIs now allowed to invest in green bonds. So what are the aspects of it? We'll discuss. And then something related to the National Green Tribunal and its ruling on Yamuna. So these are the articles that we are going to discuss in detail. And then after that, from the prelims perspective, we have these 2 articles. First, IMF forecast India's economy to grow 6.8% this year. So we'll discuss them. And then something called as imported inflation. What is imported inflation? We'll discuss that. So these are the 2 articles from prelims perspective. And then we have one revisited headline, and this is new panel to address issues of LGBTQ plus community. So we'll discuss all these articles. So let's begin with the first article, and this is on your editorial page, Step Back. Now what we know is that on 14th of April, Iran had launched a significant drone and missile attack on Israel. And in retaliation, this was in retaliation for an earlier bombing of its embassy that happened in Damascus by Israel. Now, when it comes to this particular attack, this attack actually had killed 2 Iranian generals and 5 senior officers, and this is something that escalated the tensions significantly between these 2 nations. Now, Iran targeted Israel directly from its territory, marking a very severe increase in hostilities altogether. Despite the potential for a broader conflict, Israel, with support from the US, UK, France, Jordan, etc., has very successfully been able to intercept most of all these projectiles. Now, in this context, what we basically see is, so we know that Israel attacked in Damascus, then Iran retaliated, and then after that, what we have seen after this is that this is something that can lead to a severe conflict or a severe escalation in the conflict in this area. Now, with the help of the support from all the other countries, we saw that Israel was able to intercept 99% of all the incoming missiles and drones, etc. Now, in this context, what we have seen is that Iran claims that its actions were in self-defense, and it has considered the matter resolved for now, while Israel and the allies have praised the effectiveness of the missile defense system but have urged a restraint to avoid any kind of regional war. Now, the broader context here, it involves ongoing severe tensions that we have in West Asia. Whether you talk about the Israel-Palestine issue, the kinds of attacks that they've done in Gaza, and at the same time, Israel's repeated military actions as well, where we have seen even the attack that happened on the Iranian embassy, they have brought it to the verge of war with Iran. And this is a conflict that could have very severe implications for the entire region, not only the entire region, but rather the entire world. And that's why this situation right now, it remains precarious, and there is a potential for very significant escalation from here on. And that's why we have seen that from the perspective of India also, India has taken a very neutral stance and has tried to ensure that the tensions do not escalate. We also have been talking to both the nations, and we have not taken any sides in this matter, which is very, very crucial at this point of time. And even if you look at the other international responses, the responses of the West, the responses of the US, the European countries also have not been very severe, because they also have condemned the attack from the Iranian side, but at the same time, they did not ask for any further escalation. They did not ask Israel to go forward and let this escalate further. They only praised the defense system, that Israel has a good defense system, and they were able to ensure that the attacks did not have any casualties for Iran. for Israel. So that's why from this perspective, right now we see that the world is ensuring or trying to ensure that the things do not escalate. But problem is that when it comes to the matter of how the Iran-Israel issue has been going on for quite a while now, we do not know what direction it might take. Because we have seen that after the attack from Iranian side, we have seen that Israel now is saying that we might go further and we might do something and there will be a response, and these kind of things and these kind of threats are being made. So we do not know whether it will go in that direction. We must just hope that something of that sort do not happen, because it will have a severe repercussion not only for the stability of that particular region but even for a country like India. So that's why we have to understand the importance of these aspects. Now coming to the second article, reforms needed in the voting process. Now here in this particular article, we are basically talking about the EVMs and VVPATs and also some of the other practices that we have seen across the world. Now, are these practices usable in India? Do we need to look at something which is an alternative to the electronic voting machine? So these are the things that are being discussed in this article. So let's try to understand some of the aspects of what is there in the article and something that is not there in this article. Now the entire story basically tries to outline the development of the voting process in India and some of the international practices, trying to highlight the adoption of the evolution of the EVMs, and alongside the voter verifiable paper audit trail, that is VVPAT, very often in discussion in the past few months. Now overall what we have seen is that if you look at the previous voting processes in India, you'll see that we used to have separate boxes for each and every candidate, and the votes were being placed on blank papers and their chosen candidates would be given. So you would have a basic blank paper, and this was 1952 and 1957 elections, where you would have blank papers on which you have to write the names or the symbols, names of the candidates, and then there will be separate boxes. You just keep your paper in the box that you want. So this is basically what will happen, that you would have blank paper and you would write the name of the chosen candidate and put it in the box which was allocated to that particular candidate. Then after that we saw that we got introduced to the ballot paper listing candidates and their symbols, where the voters would mark their preference. Alright, so this is where we see that the ballot paper came into the picture, and in this ballot paper there will be the list, and this list will contain all the names of the candidates along with their party symbol. Alright, and then you would have to just mark the one which is correct, which you want to vote for, and then it will be put on the ballot box. Now then when it comes to the EVM introduction, first time the trial of EVMs happened in 1982, and for the first time it was adopted widely in 2001 where we saw that in several states it was used, and in 2004 general elections we saw that the EVMs were used widely. Now after that what we see is that the Supreme Court mandated a VVPAT system back in 2013 to ensure that a paper trail for verification was also there, and this is something that was implemented in 2019 election. So this is basically how we have been. So we started from a blank paper based voting system to a ballot paper to the EVMs, and then after that EVMs along with VVPAT. So this is where right now where we are. So initially we started with separate boxes for candidates, and then ballot papers came in, and then after that EVMs were introduced, and then came the VVPATs. Now after that what we see is that many of the other countries, when we look at some of the international practices, many of the countries, they use paper ballot, and this is where they cite reliability of the paper ballot. For example, in case of Germany, the court in Germany had deemed EVMs unconstitutional back in 2009. In the US, England, France, Netherlands, they've all moved away from EVMs after trials. In some of the other countries like Brazil uses EVMs extensively while when we look at some of our neighbors like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where we have seen that paper ballots are being preferred. And that's why we have seen that again in case of Bangladesh also, they also reversed a decision to use EVMs after some trials that they had done. Now overall, when we look at EVMs, and we'll discuss that in another article as well, what we look at EVMs, that EVMs basically have reduced the vote fraud and they have eliminated the invalid votes as well. They are eco-friendly and they also improve the administrative ease and the speed of counting also. So that's why it becomes very crucial in this particular scenario, that when it comes to the EVMs, why are EVMs seen to be so important in India? We have seen that they have been able to eliminate invalid votes. They have been able to eliminate invalid votes. Then at the same time, they are also eco-friendly because you do not use a lot of paper. So they are eco-friendly as well. And then after that, the administrative ease that we see with the help of the EVMs, and then at the same time they also help in improving the speed of counting. But most importantly, they have been able to eliminate voting frauds. So from this perspective, we see that EVMs become very crucial in a country like India. Now overall, when it comes to EVMs, we have seen that random EVM allocation, a pre-poll mock tests, and some of, let's say, some having some kind of transparency becomes very, very crucial. Because what some of the concerns that have been raised against EVMs is that they can be susceptible to hacking, and lack of scientific basis in the sample size for VVPAT verification could also be a problem, and these kind of issues can lead to identification and intimidation by revealing the booth-wise polling behavior. So that's why there are some of the concerns like these which have been raised in some of the cases. So now if we think of a way forward, that what lies ahead, what should we try? Way forward would suggest that there should be a scientific approach to VVPAT sample making, by maybe dividing the states into larger regions for more accurate verification, introducing the idea of using something called as a totalizer machine to aggregate the voter from multiple EVMs before displaying the results, to protect the voter privacy and also to try and enhance the confidence in the electoral process altogether. So maybe there are some things that can be done, because there are suggestions also for 100% VVPAT verification of EVMs, but we also have to see how feasible that is, because that will mean a very exhaustive task altogether to verify each and every VVPAT with the EVMs. So we have to see how exactly it goes, and in the context of another article that we are going to discuss today, after this article we'll discuss this further. Now the next article that we have is, why has India allowed FIIs to invest in its green bonds? Now there are certain concepts and there are certain terms which have been used in this article, which we should understand what exactly are we talking about before going to the article. So for example, this article talks about sovereign green bonds. We are talking about the sovereign green bonds. Now when it comes to the sovereign green bonds, just understand what exactly do we mean by it. These are basically government issued bonds which are specifically aimed at funding projects that help reduce the environmental impact and promote sustainability. And these funds are basically raised to use it for green projects like renewable energy, pollution control, sustainable transportation, etc. So they will be called as green or sovereign green bonds. Alright, so this is basically what, just understand this, that these bonds are aimed at funding the projects that help transition India to a low carbon economy. So specifically issued by the government, funding of the projects which help reduce the environmental impact and promote sustainability. So this is what we will call as green bonds or sovereign green bonds. Now in this context, here we are also talking about FIIs. FIIs basically stand for foreign institutional investors. All right. In this case, we are, if you look at this article, we are talking about the FIIs. So when we say FII basically stand for foreign institutional investors, and these are investors such as let's say insurance companies or maybe sovereign wealth funds, and which are basically coming from some of the other countries that invest in a foreign country's financial market. So suppose that you have an insurance firm, or you have any financial institution that belongs to some other country, but they are investing in India. All right, they belong to some other country, but they are investing in various different kinds of financial market in India. Then in that case, they are called as FIIs or foreign institutional investors. So now in this context, they are basically allowed to invest in India's green bonds. Now then there is another term that has been used in this particular article, and this is greenium. This is a term that is greenium. Now greenium basically is a term that is combining green and premium, which is basically referring to the lower yield that the investors accept when investing in green bonds compared to more traditional investments. So that's why greenium. Greenium basically is green plus premium. All right, green plus premium. So green plus premium, this is basically where we are saying that the premium that they get out of these investments, that is called as greenium. Now this greenium largely would have a lower yield. All right, so investors would accept that, okay, fine, this is going to have a lower yield as compared to the normal bonds that we invest in. Now this basically reflects the premium that is paid by the investors in terms of lower return for contributing to environmental sustainability. So that is what we call as greenium. Now in this context, greenium also becomes very, very crucial, because this is where we need to understand the importance of altogether how we would be able to get in more investments into India with the help of these FIIs. Then after that, another term that is very, very crucial in this context of what we are discussing is greenwashing. Something that has already been asked in your UPSC Prelims paper as well. Greenwashing. Greenwashing basically is something where it involves falsely portraying an organization's product or activities or policies as environmentally friendly when in reality they are not. All right, so it may so happen that a company says that, look, we are doing this, and by doing this we become sustainable, by doing this we become eco-friendly, that this is an eco-friendly practice that we have. So that will be called as greenwashing, that where it actually in reality it is not, but they are deceiving you to think into this. So that's why it is a deceptive practice that are used to attract environmentally friendly conscious customers and investors. So in this context, that's why greenwashing is another term that has been used here. Now overall, when it comes to understanding of how exactly the things work, so in case of greenwashing, basically it is falsely portraying an organizations, you can say policies, activities, products, etc. Organizations, products, policies, etc. as eco-friendly. So in reality they might not be, but they would portray that to be. For example, there are two big companies in the mobile phone market, and I'll not name these companies. but there are two very big companies of the mobile phone market who do not give you chargers with their phones, and they say that they are not giving you chargers because they are trying to save plastic, and by doing this they are becoming eco-friendly. But the reality is different, because you need a charger. So here the assumption is that you already have the charger, but what if you don't? If you don't have the charger, you will buy the charger, and maybe you will buy a cheaper version of the charger. Maybe you do an online ordering, and if you do an online ordering, so what happens then is that it has to fly from somewhere. Then you are also using carbon dioxide emissions of the aviation. We discussed this yesterday as well, that how the aviation industry contributes to carbon dioxide emission. So then what happens is that overall carbon footprint increases rather than decreasing. So you did not help. So that's why these companies, when they are saying that they are doing something like this, they are not completely being truthful in what they are showing as eco-friendly. Now another term that has been used here is green taxonomy. Alright, another term that has been used is green taxonomy. Green taxonomy. Now green taxonomy basically is a classification system that defines what qualifies as an environmentally sustainable economic activity. And that's why it helps the investors and the policymakers to determine which investments are genuinely green and contribute to the environmental objectives. So that's why it is very, very important that it is a kind of classification system that defines what qualifies, a classification system that determines what qualifies as an eco-friendly practice, alright, or activity. So that's why this is something that helps the investors and policymakers to determine which kind of investments are genuinely green and contribute to environmental objectives. Now let me come back to this particular article. Now what we have seen is that the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, decided on April 5th to allow the FIIs or foreign institutional investors to invest in India's sovereign green bonds. Now these bonds basically, as we know, that these are special types of government securities that fund projects which are aimed at helping India to transition into a low carbon economy. Now the money that is raised through these bonds, they are specifically used for renewable energy projects or maybe reducing pollution and some of the environmentally beneficial activities. Now this is a part of a very broad effort to achieve India's climate goals, which include reducing the carbon intensity of its economy and moving towards a net zero emission by 2070. Correct? So this is basically what we want, that we want to transition into meeting India's 2070 net zero targets and reducing carbon intensity by 45%. And this is something that we have taken, that by 2030 we will have at least 50% of our energy needs being taken care of by non-fossil fuel based energy area. Now in this particular scenario, earlier what we have seen is that in 2022 the RBI had issued the sovereign green bonds worth 16,000 crores in two separate sales. So there were 16,000 crores that were initially issued by the RBI, and these bonds were primarily bought by domestic banks and the financial institutions, what we also call as DIIs. So initially all this were bought by DIIs or domestic institutional investors. So largely these were domestic banks and financial institutions. Now what happens is that these issues were more popular than expected and they were actually oversubscribed, meaning that more investments happened than 16,000 crores. Now this indicated very high interest in green investments. Now, so this is where we understood that, okay, fine, there is a lot of interest in buying these sovereign green bonds. Now after this, what we see is that when it comes to the FIIs, we have to understand why to include FIIs, because by allowing a foreign investor to buy these bonds, India is expanding the pool of potential investors, and which is something that can bring in more money for these green projects. And foreign investors, they very often look for opportunities in the investment in a manner that they can invest in the sustainable projects around the world, and which also helps them meet their own green investment targets as well, and they also diversify their investment portfolio by doing this. So that's why it becomes, you can say in a manner, a win-win situation for both. That on one hand, it serves our purpose, that we are able to get everything that we need from these investors, and at the same time these investors also get to invest, they are able to get and complete their targets, and at the same time they are able to diversify their portfolio as well in terms of their investments. Now what we have seen is that despite offering lower interest rates than typical government bonds, these green bonds are very attractive because they count towards the SLR, or statutory liquidity ratio, and this requirement, it helps to ensure that banks have safe and liquid assets available. Now the difference in yield that we have between the green bonds and the regular bonds basically is where we talk about the concept of greenium, where we see that a small cost for contributing to the environmental sustainability can be seen, but we have seen that a lot of investors are fine with it, that we do not see that that a lot of investors, they mind something like this, they don't. So that's why we have to understand this, that they offer lower yield as compared to the general government securities, and at the same time we see that it helps in encouraging institutions to accept lower return for green investments. And for FIIs, what we see is that first they would be able to diversify their portfolios as we discussed, and then after that it also helps India's standing in international green finance and promoting sustainable or substantial and credible green projects. So that's why I'm saying that this is something which becomes a win-win situation for both. All right, because for India we are getting the required investments, correct? We are getting the required investments, and for the FIIs, they meet their targets that they have for investing in green projects, and at the same time they are able to diversify. So that's why we see that this becomes a win-win situation for both. Now at the same time we also have to combat greenwashing. Now to make sure that the projects are funded, the projects that are funded by these bonds are genuinely environmentally friendly and they are not just marketing ploys, the Finance Ministry also had set up a very detailed framework in 2022. And this framework, it also outlines what kind of projects qualify for funding and ensures that these projects are verifiably green. That the concept of greenwashing or the problem of greenwashing does not creep into this kind of investment. That it should not happen that let's say that a company or any institutional investor has just invested in something which looks to be environmentally friendly, but maybe in reality it is not. So that's why we saw that this is where the Finance Ministry also set up a certain framework to ensure and verify that okay, these are the kinds of projects, only these are the kinds of projects where this funding will be allowed, where funding in the terms of green investments or green bonds, sovereign green bonds will be allowed. So that also becomes very, very crucial to counter the problem of greenwashing in this entire setup. Now when it comes to this entire framework, we see that the green framework for these bonds was also reviewed by Cicero. Now in this particular scenario, Cicero is a respected independent research center, and that's why compared to the international standards which are set by the International Capital Market Association, we have seen that in this case Cicero gave India's framework a favorable review, and that's why it also enhances the credibility of these bonds on the international stage as well. So that's why just understand this, because there are a lot of these kind of articles which will keep coming up in the future also, and I expect that an article like this or this particular entire setup for your upcoming examinations can be very, very crucial, both in your prelims and your mains examination, because we have seen that a lot of governments have been asking for these kind of funding, and now we see that India is trying to make sure that we not only get support from the domestic investors but also from the foreign investors in its own sovereign green bonds. So that's why first I started with all those terms, so that you should understand the meaning of those terms, and then the article and everything that the article also says. Now coming back to the discussion of EVMs, and again it will be in the newspaper, most probably in tomorrow's newspaper also, or maybe day after newspaper, because again we see that this is an ongoing discussion happening in the Supreme Court, and further discussions are still to happen in the upcoming days, today and tomorrow. So that's why we have to see how exactly and where exactly it goes. Now overall, what exactly are we seeing in this particular article? Supreme Court says EVMs are accurate unless they are maligned by human bias. Now what we have seen in this context is that the Supreme Court of India, which was led by Justice Sanjeev Khanna and comprising other Supreme Court judges, Justice Dipankar Datta, they recently addressed the concerns about the electronic voting machines versus paper ballot. And during the session, both the justices, they expressed their confidence in the accuracy of the EVMs, stating that they provide absolutely accurate results unless affected by human bias. They rejected the notion of reverting to paper ballots and referencing to the flaws that were observed in the past elections with such a system. Now the court was considering the petitions that were challenging the efficacy and transparency of the EVMs, advocating for methods that might increase the voter confidence. And in this particular scenario, what we see is that the petitioners, they suggested alternatives, where they also talked about returning to the paper ballot and modifying the VVPAT machines to provide slips to the voters, or making VVPAT screens transparent. Now, in this particular scenario, Justice Khanna highlighted the importance of relying on data from Election Commission to assess EVM performance rather than opinions from private entities. The court basically has plans to further review the performance of EVMs based on the comprehensive data, while the petitions, they basically had argued for a system that ensures voter confidence and transparency, referring to the practices in other countries. For example, a country like Germany, as we had taken as an example in the previous article as well. Now, in totality, what we see is that Supreme Court has been seen to be open to evaluating the functionality of EVMs based on factual data, but has remained skeptical about the discarding them into the favor of traditional paper ballot. And this is where the observations were made, and it was emphasized on the fact that when you go back to the paper ballots, we have seen the problems. We have seen the problems with the paper ballots, and we have seen what kind of voting frauds can happen with paper ballots. For example, booth capturing used to be a thing, and used to happen very easily in many of the states. So that's why you cannot go back to a system where the system was flawed. So unfortunately, paper ballot cannot be an option, and this is something that Supreme Court also said, and it is very commonsensical in this approach to even think that paper ballot, I mean, I don't know how exactly they would even say that paper ballot is an option, because paper ballot very easily leads to voting frauds, and this is what was also observed in the Supreme Court discussion, where Justice Khanna also had expressed this view that we have seen the past. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past rather than just going back to the same mistakes, where we have seen so easily booth capturing would happen, voting frauds would happen, and it was not a very easily conductible process. And also at the same time, we have to understand the problems, because comparing Indian election system or electoral system to Germany's is not wise, because the population size is extremely high when it comes to India. For example, Germany's population is, you can say, more or less the population of West Bengal. So you cannot just say that, okay, a country which has this kind of population, which can be compared to population of just one state in India, both can have the same systems. And at the same time, the kinds of voting frauds that we have seen in the past with paper ballot in India has not happened in Germany. So that's why it's easier for Germany, and in that sense even counting of the votes is not going to be easy. And the only problem that we are talking about, human bias, the human bias problem will come up more when it comes to counting of the paper ballots, more than the counting of the EVM machines, where human bias is going to be way less as compared to paper ballots. So that's why paper ballots cannot be an option. We have to look for the other aspects, and where a verifiable system like VVPAT can be a very good alternative to ensuring that transparency in the voting system if something like this is required. Then coming to another article, 9 years after Green Panel's directions, Yamuna floodplain yet to be demarcated. Now in this particular scenario, when we are talking about this article talks about a problem with what we have seen. The process of physically demarcating the Yamuna river's floodplains in Delhi, it remains incomplete despite explicit directives from the National Green Tribunal and the claims by the Delhi government that the task has been completely accomplished. Now, the demarcation is very crucial for identifying and protecting the floodplain, and which is something which is a very sensitive ecosystem, and this has to be saved from encroachments. Now, despite the Delhi government's assertion that floodplains in Wazirabad to Jaipur was completely demarcated, investigations that were reported by the Hindu, it revealed that there were very substantial gaps in this particular claim, and physical markers such as the bollards and flag posts reportedly installed were completely absent from these areas, and that indicated incomplete work, particularly from Okhla to Jaipur area. Now the situation basically is compounded by failure to even address the illegal constructions that have happened on these floodplains. We have seen that when it comes to the National Green Tribunal's judgment that happened in 2015, it ordered for identification and removal of all these encroachments. Now the judgment basically had also aimed to restore the floodplain to its natural state by 2017. This goal still remains unmet. The development projects and illegal colonies, they have encroached significantly into the floodplains over the years, and with notable constructions, whether it is about the Commonwealth Games Village or Yamuna Bank metro station that has been built on the vulnerable areas. Now, the process of demarcation and the removal of the encroachments, they have faced bureaucratic delays and alleged corruption, with insiders also suggesting collusion between land mafia officials and politicians as well. Moreover, even the stretches that were demarcated are reportedly inaccurately marked, and they have excluded significant portions of the floodplain. So that's why we see that there are a lot of these issues that we have to understand. And following the devastating floods that happened in July 2023, which highlighted the risk of the consequences of such negligence, the National Green Tribunal had formed another committee to expedite the demarcation and address the encroachments. Yet what we see is that this committee too missed its initial deadlines, and there were a lot of challenges like lack of proper maps and coordination among the government bodies, etc. So the situation on the ground in areas like Jaipur, etc., they reflect the stark reality of the unchecked urban expansion that has happened into the flood-prone zones, and with new constructions continuing to emerge every day. And that's why this is something that is further increasing the flood risk and the environmental degradation altogether. So that's why this ongoing issue represents not only a failure to comply with the judicial orders, but also a significant environmental oversight that has impacted the river's health and the city's resilience against problems of flooding. So that's why we have to understand all these issues, and where these issues can actually lead to a lot more devastations than what we have seen until now. Now let's look at the articles from the perspective of your prelims examination. The first article that we have is IMF forecasts India's economy to grow 6.8% this fiscal year. Now in this particular scenario, what we basically see is that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has upgraded its GDP growth forecast for India to 6.8%. The previous estimate that was given was of 6.5%. Alright, so it has anticipated that the growth will be of 6.8% next year and of 6.5% the next year or the following year after that. Now this revision, it reflects a global economic resilience despite the challenges that we have seen after the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only COVID-19 pandemic, but even the Russia-Ukraine issue, the monetary tightening that has happened worldwide, even then we have seen that there is a resilience that has been shown by the world economy. And IMF basically has reported a steady global growth at 3.2%. At 3.2% for both 2024 and 25. Now in case of India, a moderation in growth from 7.8% last year has been attributed also to stricter monetary and fiscal policies that has been aimed to control inflation. And that's why we have seen that this is where we see that inflation numbers, if we see, it has been projected to be at 4.6% this year and then 4.2% the next year. However, when we look at the potential economic reforms, it could actually enhance the foreign investments, and that's why export opportunities might also rise, potentially also boosting the growth and employment opportunities in India further. So that's why the IMF also noted a favorable global economic outlook with easing of the inflation, projecting it to decrease from 2.8% to 2.4% by the end of 2025. And that's why we see that it also had mentioned a reduced economic scarring of the post-COVID-19 situation, and except in low income regions. So that's why it also cautioned against rising service sector inflation, which could actually impact the overall disinflation trends that we are looking at in the world right now. So this is basically what it has said about the world economy, about the Indian economy, and about the inflation numbers in India altogether. So this is where we have to see how exactly the things go in this direction. Now coming to another concept, imported inflation. Imported inflation, how import costs can increase the prices of goods and services. Now in this context, what we basically are saying is that there is something called as imported inflation. Imported inflation happens when a country has to pay more for the goods it has to buy from other countries, and this can make things very expensive in the local market. So that is called as imported inflation. So occurs when the cost of imported goods and services rise, leading to higher overall domestic prices. Now overall what we have seen is that one common reason for imported inflation is when the value of a country's currency goes down as compared to some of the other currencies. And if the currency is worth less, you basically would need more of it to buy the same thing, correct, from abroad. And that's why it makes imports costlier. Understand this. What are we saying? So overall what we understand is that, let's say the value of rupee is less. If the value of rupee depreciates, what happens? The value of rupee is less, 100 rupees is worth less as compared to what it was. So if you have to buy something worth rupees 100, the value of rupees 100 has decreased. So you have to you have to use more of the domestic currency or the Indian currency to buy the same good. So as you see, for example, let's say you might have seen that the rupee has become weaker as compared to the dollar, and it has become weaker in the last couple of years. So in that sense, what happens is that, let's say something that we had to buy for $100. So now the value of $100 is more. So you have to use more Indian rupee to get something worth $100. So that's why what happens is that in this case what will happen is the imports will become costlier. The imports will become costlier. So this is basically what will happen in this particular scenario, and this is called as imported inflation. So that's why what we see is that we have to understand that what may happen is that, let's say suppose Indian rupee is losing its value because of higher interest rates in the Western countries. This could make imported goods more expensive in India. Now the prices in a country can also rise because of the increasing cost of imported goods. For example, oil in the global market. So even if the currency value stays the same, if the oil prices have gone up globally, it will still end up in costing more for the country. So that's why many a times we have to understand that it's not only about currency changes, all right? Even without currency changes, even if let's say there is no currency change, suppose that the value of rupee and the value of the dollar, it remains the same, yet the price of a certain commodity has gone up, that instead of costing $100, now it is costing $110. So even if let's say the relative value of rupee and dollar has remained the same, because the commodity price has increased, you still have to spend more. So your imported goods are still costing more, correct? Imported goods are still costing more. So even if the currency value still remains the same, yet if the prices of a commodity goes up, you would still be spending more to buy a certain commodity. And some of the economists, they also argue that just because import costs goes up, it doesn't mean that the price at home will also rise, because they believe that what really matters is how much people are willing to pay for a certain product. If people aren't willing to pay for higher prices, then the price might not increase at all, correct? Because let's say you know that, okay, this is a commodity, I cannot pay more than this much amount of money for this commodity. Then the companies, everyone will have to ensure that the price does not go up, because if the price goes beyond that, probably I'm not going to buy it. So that is also something that has to be kept into check, and that's why we see that a lot of these things will be kept into account always. Calculations will be done alongside all these things, that if the value of a product is not worth beyond a certain cost, then people will not buy it, and then you will have to make sure that the prices, they do not increase. So ultimately prices are determined by the consumer demand, and if the consumers are willing to pay more for a certain product, prices might go up. But if they aren't, then the prices might stay the same or maybe even drop if people are not willing to pay. So that's why we have to understand that there are all these aspects of the prices, and it's not only about imports that always would determine the price. Now lastly, coming to a revisited article, and this is new panel to address issues of LGBTQ plus community. The Ministry of Law and Justice in India recently announced the formation of a 6-member committee tasked with addressing issues relevant to the queer community in India. The committee will be led by the Cabinet Secretary and will propose the strategies to prevent the discrimination against the queer community in accessing the goods and services, and to protect them from any kind of violence or discrimination. The establishment of this committee, it follows a directive from the Supreme Court last October during the hearing of a plea related to the same-sex marriage. The court also has instructed that a panel should be formed to tackle the challenges which are faced by the queer community in India, and this is something which is in line with the promises that have been made by the center in the court. Now the action coincides with the enforcement of the model code of conduct also, just before the initial phase of the voting in the Lok Sabha elections. So we have to see how exactly it goes and where it goes, but it is something which becomes very, very crucial part of a problem that we see in India, which needs to be addressed on priority, so that any kind of discrimination or violence can be taken care of in this context of especially the LGBTQ plus community. So lastly, let's come to the mains questions for the day. First question, examine the role of sovereign green bonds in financing India's climate goals. Discuss how the inclusion of foreign institution investors in the purchase of these bonds could impact India's transition to a sustainable economy. So we discussed about the sovereign green bonds and why they are important, how they are important, why for the future of the country and the world it is very important, and inclusion of the FIIs, what advantage do they bring for India. So those are the things that you have to discuss in this question. Discuss the implications of administrative lapses on urban planning and environmental sustainability. Now this is something which is with respect to the discussion that we did for the Yamuna floodplains, Yamuna river floodplains. So it's not only about the river floodplain, but think of some of the other aspects of the urban planning as well, and how we see that urban planning needs to be done ensuring environmental sustainability. Think of it. You see a lot of things all around you. You know some of these points. Think of these points. Write these points in the comments. We will respond. We will see whether your points are valid or not. But think of points, and you know the points. It's not that it's something that I need to explain you and then only you will realize it. Write these points maybe in the comments and we'll respond. If there are things that you have missed, we'll tell you what you have missed. Alright, so with this we come to the end of today's session. I hope that this session helps you in your examination. Thank you very much for being here.